Welcome everybody. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm the Executive Director of AFIKRA. Nice to see you here. It is my honor to welcome our special guest. Kamal Dib is a Canadian Lebanese scholar and professor of political and economic studies. He has worked as a Director of Economic and Social Research in the Canadian government for 15 years. He's held many positions related to economics and finance and labor. He is the author of many books related to those subjects and currently is based in Canada. We are going to be talking mostly about his books, Warlords and Merchants, as well as his series of books about Intra. Kamal, thank you so much for joining AFIKRA Conversations.
Thank you.
I should say Dr. Kamal Dib, but if you'll permit me, I'll call you Kamal for the rest of it.
That's fine, yeah.
Great. Kamal, it's a really honor to have you here. I'm curious if I believe you grew up in Lebanon as a child. And so I'm curious how interested you were in economics and political theory and sort of economic and politics and the intersection of those two disciplines as a kid growing up. How soon into your childhood did you know, I think I want to study this stuff?
Yeah. It's easy to answer this. It's related to what the Lebanese have, which we call the Canaanite guilt. That is, if you grow up in Lebanon and the Levantine countries in general, and you drank the water there and ate the food, it remains under your skin. So although I came to Canada as a child, yet the memories remained from childhood, and also the upbringing from my parents required that I read a lot of books outside my schoolwork. Yeah. So eventually I became interested in the history of the region, and also the liberty and the new horizon of Canada gave me the capacity to look at things from far away, with the objectivity and academic view. And what happened is when I was in third year university, I started reading material, and the professor required a paper. So it was a third year course on third world development, and I asked him to write something about Lebanon. And happily I found a 20-page article about Intra. I haven't read about Intra before in all the books I've read about on Lebanon and its history. So I became curious, especially when I found that it shed a new light on what's going on in Lebanon and the causes of the war and the aftermath and all that. So I wrote the short paper of 7 to 10 pages. Yes, go ahead.
No, I'm going to ask, if I may ask, what year was this?
In the 90s, about 95. And then it opened my interest, and I decided to write a book. So Warlords and Merchants is the effort of almost 10 years of writing and revising and changing and adding until it came out in London in 2005 in English. Yeah. So the Intra took only one chapter of that book.
Yeah. Let's wait before you get into this. Let's come back to it, because I have a question about some of the biography, your own personal biography, before we get to that stuff. As a child, I'm younger than you, but as a child, I wasn't aware of Intra as a story. I'm curious, for you, were you not aware of its importance growing up? Was that a name you had heard as an important business story, or you didn't know it either?
No, when this happened, it happened in 1966.
Yeah.
So by that time I was only like 2 years old, and it wouldn't ring a bell. And by the time I came to Canada and studied and went through university, I still did not hear about it. Yet I was reading here and there by authoritative, or let's say authorized books or articles that Intra was by some Palestinian guy whose name was Yousef Beidas, and he was a thief, etc. So I just skipped over it and just went ahead to complete the story. But as you know, in academic standards, when you doubt something, when you doubt 1%, then you have to doubt 100%. So my doubt into the affair of the Intra crisis of 1966 led me to doubt the entire modern Lebanese history. And that was the genesis of my first book, which is Point de Départ. It's a point of departure for me into the more 20 books that I wrote after that.
Yeah. So on the screen here, for those who can't see the screen, you've written about Syria, you've written about Iraq, you've written about culture, you've written about a lot of different stuff. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I'd like to focus on Warlords and Merchants, which was published in English, as well as a trilogy focusing on the Intra Empire and Money Sharks, with 3 different characters that you focus on, one in each book: Beidas, Roger Tamraz, and Rafi al-Hariri. So if we may, if it's okay with you, I want to understand a little bit about each chapter, some of the chapters of Warlords and Merchants, and then have you tell a little bit of the story about how these 3 figures are connected and why it helps tell the story from your perspective of the 20th century Lebanon and the making of where Lebanon is in the 21st century. So let's talk about Warlords and Merchants. This book is quite expansive in its scope. It came out in 2006. Help me understand the framing of this book, why you started it, where you started it time-wise, and what you were trying to achieve in this book.
As I have said, I started writing it in 1995. I was a student, and it took me 10 years to get it published in London, as I've said. Now, the idea is about Lebanon being a country today, a modern country, is really based on mythology that was established in the early 20th century. Before that, Lebanon was part of a greater area called the Levant. And the Levant is today's what we call Bilad al-Sham, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And the areas closer to the coast, to the Mediterranean coast, were inhabited by various religious groups. And those religious groups were feudalistic and led by leaders who are supposed to pay taxes to the Ottomans or whatever empires that existed before them. And that kind of origin continues today. Yes, the warlords are sophisticated. They travel the world. They use the latest technology. They own TV stations. They own universities, hospitals, etc. But they are descendants of the same mountain people that rode horsebacks and used the sword 1,000 years ago. So there is a continuity, and the problem that I try to explain in this book is that no matter how the world progress and how modernity invades Lebanon in several facets, let's say globalization or democracy, etc., the basic elements of the warlord society remains. Now, of course, there are modern elements, modern political parties, modern business people, but the basic feudalistic structure remains. Now, the merchants happened in the late 19th century after the penetration of French capitalism of the Levant. And this penetration was more successful in what came to become Lebanon. So the merchants are essentially outside this warlord structure of the mountainous and remote regions of the Bekaa Valley and elsewhere. And there was a happy marriage in the early 20s between the business people and finance people of Beirut, who basically came also from Aleppo, from Damascus, from elsewhere in neighboring Syria. And that created the Lebanese Republic. And the philosopher, or let's say the motivator behind this, was a banker and intellectual, Michel Chiha, who co-authored the Lebanese constitution. And from there on, if you try to really understand what's going on in Lebanon, you will say it's un mariage. It's really a happy marriage between the ancient warlords and the new merchants or the modern merchants. Let's pick up by way of testing this theory. Any period you want. In the 1990s, the merchants were represented, for example, by Rafik Hariri, and the warlords were the triumphal militias or warlords, Nabih Berri and Walid Jumblat, and whatever remained of the Lebanese forces of Ilih Baika. So then you have this, and today in 2021, you will find the same alliance of warlords and merchants. So basically, I'm happy with this, with the thesis of the book, because no matter what time passes, and the second thing is that this book was translated into Arabic in 2007, and it's selling fast that it is today in the 7th edition.
So let's instead of stretching across decades, before we get to that, I want to understand the interaction between these groups. What was happening at the formation of the Republic? Why is there a chapter called Bechara Khoury and Michel Chiha? You talked about Michel Chiha. What was the interaction between the political class and economic class? Forget the warlord title. Forget that word entirely. Let's actually, if it's okay with you, for the sake of the conversation, let's be a little more precise about this. The political class and the economic class, how were these two classes intertwined at that point?
Sure. In almost every chapter, I did my best to bring in a personality from the warlords and personality from the merchants. And in this particular case, Michel Chiha, who is Roman Catholic, that is Catholic of the Latin, right? Because in Lebanon, we have Greek Catholics who are not to be confused with the Roman Catholics who also adhered to Rome. So he was Roman Catholic, not Greek Catholic, and his origins are in Iraq. So Michel Chiha and family, and they married to fortune and to banking with the Pharaoh family. And they established the Pharaoh and Chiha Bank. Now, this gentleman studied law, and he became co-author of the Lebanese constitution. And behind him, almost 500 business people who lived in Beirut and who essentially came also from Damascus and Aleppo, as I have explained. Bechara al-Khoury was a lawyer, but he was also a child of the feudalistic warlords. He came from the Shuf region, and his family participated in the local autonomy of Mount Lebanon under the Ottomans. So I'm saying there was a happy marriage. Now, Michel Chiha and Bechara al-Khoury are related through marriage and through cousins, inter-cousins, etc. Now, multiply that by, let's say, the Bankers Association in Lebanon. You will find that membership in the Bankers Association is either from former politicians who became bankers, or bankers who became politicians, who became ministers, who became prime ministers, who became presidents, like Ilyas Sarkis, like Salim Al-Hos, like Pierre Roufail, etc. Or, for example, Henry Pharaon. So in every aspect in Lebanon, you will find the marriage and the close relationship between these clannish families whose origin is either in big money or in feudalistic background.
Okay, just for the sake of time, if we keep on going down the chronology, there's a chapter also dedicated to Boustany and Chamoun. Is it essentially the same? Is there something interesting that you're uncovering in this chapter that you think is worth mentioning, or is it basically the same thing?
Yes. Now, in my estimate, Camille Chamoun plus the president who came after him, Fawwaz Shab, are the best two presidents in 100 years of Lebanese history. Basically, Camille Chamoun was the person who took seriously the integration of Lebanon. So he introduced Lebanese folklore, which was unknown before. Remember that we are talking in 1952. So that's 10 years or 12 years after independence. Half of the Lebanese population still recall Lebanon and Syria being one country. So you need to change that. You need to establish national identity. You need to establish belonging to the new generations. And that was successful because by 1970, people who were born in Lebanon identified themselves as being Lebanese and nothing else. And that continued today. Now for Emile Boustany, he was let's say, the forerunner of Yousef Beidas. He was a Lebanese businessman, open-minded. He meant well. He pushed for openness towards the Arab countries. He dreamt of Lebanon being part of a larger Arab market, common taxes, common currency, etc. And he established the company called CAT, from Caterpillar for construction, CAT. Yeah. So Emile Boustany and Camille Chamoun in this chapter present something positive about this happy marriage of, quote unquote, happy marriage of warlords and merchants.
Okay, great. I want to talk about, now I want to switch to really talk about banking. Okay, so in the transition between the 1940s to the 1960s, I have a graph on here about the total number of deposits that really skyrocketed during the 60s and the number of banks that skyrocketed. In 1945, there were 9 banks in Lebanon. By 1966, there were 93 banks in Lebanon. If you can talk about how these statistics correlate or are indicative of some of what was going on, some of the regulatory changes that were happening in Lebanon at the time, some of the deregulation, and how this is related to the story of Intrabank and Yousef Beidas.
Yes. I should say that after the Korea War in 1952, Lebanon had a lot of gold and a very strong currency. And also it had a stable political and economic system to the extent that it was an oasis, a paradise compared to other Arab countries. For example, Iraq and Syria and the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt, the main countries of the region, were in turmoil and revolutionary change. So a lot of people, either people escaping to Lebanon to deposit their money in their banks, and also or Palestinians who came with a lot of capital from Palestine when it was what was occupied in 1948. So Lebanon benefit from this. But I should warn here that 50% of the banks that were established in Lebanon in the late 50s and the early 60s were for prestige and not for profitability, not for business reasons. In Lebanon, to become part of the elite, the political elite and the controlling structure, it's good to have a bank, even a losing bank, even a bank that exists on paper, because it was a prestigious thing to do. Yeah. And the evidence of that is that after the Intra crisis, the number of banks collapsed by half. And Lebanon was hit by a financial burden that meant it's the end of Beirut as an international financial market. Now, another reason was because Lebanon had no central bank. A private French bank called Banque de la Syrie was taking care of issuing the currency for Lebanon and Syria, but yet this French bank sometimes made decisions and took steps that countered the interests of Lebanon and sometimes harmed the interests of Lebanon. So in 1964, Lebanon established a central bank, but by that time it was too late because by the time it was created, it was only 2 years before the collapse of the banking system in 1966.
Yeah, let's back up a little bit. So if you can just shed some light on who Beidas was. He was born in Jerusalem, Palestinian, Lebanese. former banker at Barclays Bank in Jerusalem, comes to Lebanon, brings tons of assets under management with him to Lebanon, starts a bank called Intra, is hugely successful. But if you can shed some light on what was success, why was he successful? How was he able to attract so many assets under management? Why were his returns so high? And how did he put himself in a position, or end up in a position, maybe is a better way of saying it, where he was a target of so much controversy and attacks?
Yeah. First of all, I should repeat that Lebanese history is filled with big lies. What you read about classical books about Lebanon, even recent ones, they talk about Yousef Beidas, the thief who came to Beirut barefoot, and he stole Lebanon and its money and its economy, etc. And my research uncovered that that was totally unwarranted and untrue. Eventually, he became a very patriotic Lebanese, and he was kind of the Howard Hughes or Getty or the big companies or banks that made America what it is today.
Yeah, he was like a Rockefeller type character.
Yeah, Yousef Beidas is half Palestinian, and their references that were published in Lebanon deny that. His mother was from Baskinta, Abu Rus, and his father, Khalil Beidas, is from Jerusalem. He came from a family of wealth, not of poverty. His father, Khalil Beidas, wrote 40 books, and he was a genuine member of the Arab literary Renaissance. Yeah. Yousef Beidas, also from Greek Orthodox family, is a cousin of Edward Said, the Palestinian-American thinker from Columbia University. So Yousef Beidas first worked in the English bank Barclays, and it's a Jerusalem branch. And then the Palestinians in Jerusalem in 1931-32 established the largest and most important bank in the Arab world, the Arab Bank Limited by the Chamoun family. So Beidas first became fast the director of the Jerusalem branch. And then when the Arab Bank moved its headquarters in 1948 to Amman, Yousef Beidas was married to Lebanese lady, Widad Salami. She is the nephew of the vice speaker of Lebanese parliament, Munir Abu Fadl, of the Abu Fadl Orthodox family. So he sent his family to Beirut, and he followed them, where he established an exchange office. And with his colleagues, Palestinian financiers, he opened this exchange office in downtown Beirut, and it's called International Traders. And at that time, there was no internet or email or whatever. There was telex. So the telex name of this business took the N from international and Tra from traders, and it became Intra. And when they opened the Intra Bank in 1952-53, it was called, kept the same name, Intra Bank. Now, Intra Bank, with the brains, the genius behind it, and the big capital that it had, quickly attracted funds from the Gulf states, who started to witness flows of oil money, and the rich people from Iraq and Syria and the Palestinians and Jordan.
Kamal, can you actually speak?
So that's when it became like the first bank in Lebanon in the early 60s, to the extent that the next bank in Lebanon should take place number 15 after Intra Bank.
But can you speak to what's interesting about Intra Bank, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, what's interesting about them is that he's not a genius because he wears a nice suit, right? He's a genius because he has, they employ specific investment strategies that are really pioneering at the time. Can you talk a little bit about his investment strategy, in particular, going after illiquid assets, real estate, new asset classes, because I think this is remarkable.
Yeah, actually, when the Lebanese authorities asked Interpol, the international police, to arrest Beidas in 1967-68, the Swiss authorities arrested him, and they investigated the matter, and they told the Lebanese that whatever Beidas did wrong in your eyes is totally innocent under Swiss law. So that really exonerated him. Now, to go back to his investment strategy, there's one chapter in the book that talks about his investment strategy. He sat down in his office in downtown Beirut, and he studied Lebanese commercial law. And there was nothing against mixing short-term banking, which is deposit on demand, versus long-term investments.
Yeah.
So he bought gold, and he bought property, and he bought hotels and telecommunication, and he bought, for example, the shipbuilding in La Ciotat in France, and Radio Orient in Beirut. And then he studied Hollywood. He liked American movies. So he looked at how the major studios operate, and he said, I want to make Lebanon like California, and I want to have the Bekaa Valley like Los Angeles and it's Hollywood. And he established Studio Baalbek, and he produced some of the best movies that are really the pride of Lebanon today. And he asked the people who make movies to focus on the ancient Roman ruins of Lebanon and the natural beauty. So the Egyptians took the hint, and you start seeing Baalbek and the cedars, etc., in the Egyptian movies, and that flourished after him. Yeah. So his mixing like this, and his attractivity of bringing in Arab money, Arab funds, and the facilities he gave. People should understand something about the consumer mentality of the Arabs. For example, he tells Arab emirs or princes or princesses that it's enough to show your ID or business card at any of our branches to give you your money. No checks, no investigation, nothing like that. His London offices of the Intra bank had the same building of Middle East Airlines, which was owned also by Intra bank. And today it's still owned by the descendant of Intra bank, which is it's owned by the Bank of Lebanon, but the Bank of Lebanon also, only when it took control of Intra bank in 1970. But about the London branch, the customers of Intra bank receive limousine service from the airport. They are taken to the hotels. They are fed. They are treated very well. So I'm giving some of the basic examples of what kind of things that he brought to the Arabs. So one emir from Dubai, he heard the rumors about his losing money. So Beidas invited him to his office, where he had gold bullions on his desk, and he said, "Do you want your money in the gold bullion or in dollars?" So he said, "No, I trust you. No problem. I keep my money."
So, okay, I want to, so there seems to be two things going on, right? One, he's incredible. He's an incredible marketer. He's able to bring in tons of money because of those things.
Plus talents, plus people who work with him.
Sure. And then he's able to be a really, really good investor, right? He's investing in distressed assets like Middle East Airline, converting them to profitable businesses. But at the same time, he's also considered to be, an arrogant figure who creates a bunch of enemies. I'm going to read a report from a 1960s U.S. Embassy report. And this is a direct quote from a report. You can look it up online. Beidas has been, this is a 1960 U.S. Embassy report. Beidas has been the key figure in obtaining these large accounts by his smooth, convincing talk and by the clever manner of inflating the ego of prospective clients. Beidas has apparently been irresistible to these, quote, simple sheikhs from the Arab hinterland. Again, U.S. Embassy report from 1960s. How does, I want to ask you, so let's get to the central bank now. How does it get to the point where a hugely successful bank begins to declare bankruptcy? What is happening? What is the tiff between the central bank, other bankers, and Beidas?
It's really a very long story, but I tried to explain just a little bit. When the crisis hit in 1966, the central bank was only less than 2 years old, and it took the central bank 1 or 2 years before it really started to take place. But the collapse of Intra took 2 days in the fall of 1966. Beidas was surrounded by enemies, the enemies being the club of the warlords and merchants who ganged against him for greedy purposes. I give one quick example. One former prime minister, Saeb Salam, he asked him to loan him $5 million to build a palace south of Beirut, and Beidas refused. Another one is the vice president of the Bank of Lebanon, Edgar O'Gorlian, who told him, you are Palestinians and the Lebanese don't want people to steal their economy. Yet Beidas was polite. He did not tell him that you are Armenian and your parents came from Aleppo in Syria. So there was this racism element where people in Lebanon, or let's say the upper elites, called the Palestinian refugees as two-bit Palestinians, Sha'fat Falastini, in their racist way. So they really, it mattered a great deal to them to reject the idea that some Palestinian businessmen and women, coupled with their allies inside Lebanon, should take over the banking sector in Lebanon and replace them as the movers of the Lebanese state. So that was their fear, but they did not really do their job of developing the country, helping its people. They are filthy, wealthy, and they wanted to destroy their bank to their interest. Now I give at least 20 pieces of evidence around this.
So would you say, Kamal,
yes?
Just for time's sake, would you say that the book, I mean, to me, listening to you now, it seems like the book is in defense of Beidas. It sounds like that's
not truly, but it's good you ask about that because your questions are driving towards this. But I mentioned in the book, there are chapters in the book that talk about his characteristics and his personality. For example, he was a womanizer. He did not share his thoughts and decisions with the board of directors or with the managers of the various let's say branches of the bank. He wrote things on pieces of paper and put it in his pocket and did not reveal them to other people. Some of the decisions he made, for example, the mixing and matching of assets and liabilities, all that revealed that he made several errors. I'm talking here about the criminality of the people around him in Lebanon who decided one night on 17th October that Intra should be shut down and that those thieves should take over its assets and spend it on themselves. And today you will find that the way they divided it, for example, they divided into Intra Investment Company.
Yeah.
I don't want to reveal it now, but you read in the book which warlords in 2021 control that. Middle East Airlines, who is the boss, who are the employees, who are the managers, etc. There are 180 companies that used to be owned by Bank Intra, and you go after them, who took over the property, who took over the buildings, the companies inside and outside Lebanon, the hotels, and you will find what happened. So it's really small. It's a small change to talk about how bad, quote unquote, was Yousef Beidas. Instead, you should focus on really the people who destroyed the largest bank in Lebanon and destroyed basically the banking sector in Lebanon to benefit themselves.
Yeah. And just to put in perspective, I may have this quote wrong, but I think at its peak, it controlled 60% of the deposits of the country.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was it wasn't the biggest bank by a small shot. It was the biggest bank by a long shot.
But also in the Arab world, because 2-3 years later, you start seeing the big giants from Iraq and Arabia and the Arab Bank Limited from Jordan.
Okay, I want to talk about Tamraz. So Tamraz was an investment banker, the CEO, I believe the CEO of Kidder, Peabody and Company. And his story is intertwined with Beidas' story and the story of Intrabank. After, I believe it goes into receivership, or he's supposed to come, it's taken over by the central bank. Explain this, what his role is with Intrabank.
For the sake of time, I will just speak very briefly about this. He was not CEO of Kidder Peabody. It's a big finance house in the Wall Street in New York. Now, Roger Tamraz was born in Egypt and lived most of his time before coming to Lebanon in Egypt and few years in the United States. He graduated and he found a job when he was 25, 26 years old in this company, Kidder Peabody and Company. And they sent him to Beirut to look how he can make business for this company with the Bank of Lebanon. So I met Roger Tamraz for several days in Paris, and he told me all those details and how, as 26 years old, he was able to convince the Bank of Lebanon to suggest some solution. And his solution was to pay up like they are doing today with depositors in the banks in Lebanon, to pay out the small deposits to depositors, to the customers of Intrabank, but then the big ones to give them shares in the assets of Intra. So this way, the big shareholders became foreign governments of Kuwait, Qatar, and United States, and some Lebanese business people. And that's what happened. Now, it took him 15 years to have his distant cousin, President Emile, to come to power in end of 1982. And they asked him, how can I help you? He said, I want to be the president of Intra Company. And he made him this. And then also Roger Tamraz benefited himself. And then he held himself to a lot of the assets. And one of the banks that was a turn-off of Intra Bank is Bank Al Mashriq, that was born in 1970. Also, it became owned by Roger Tamraz. And just briefly, Roger Tamraz had to escape from Lebanon in 1989 after he was kidnapped by some militiamen to embezzle him out of funds. So that's just a little take on this second volume of the Intra trilogy.
So I want to understand just when Intra, after the bankruptcy, or while it was those 2 days, I remember reading that the central bank, okay, this is what I remember reading. Tell me if I got this right. Basically, there is a depositor, there's an interbank depositor, I think from Saudi Arabia, who requires to be liquidated. He wants his money back. And it's a conspiracy that there's some coordinated attack because of some politics. Beidas goes to the central bank saying, I need liquidity because I don't have it. I'm investing all these illiquid assets. And then the central bank says, I think it was Elias Sarkis, I don't know who it was, says, I'm not going to give it to you, you're bankrupt. They bring in an accounting firm to do a valuation. The first accounting firm says, obviously they're not bankrupt, they have so many assets. then the central bank fires that accounting firm and brings in another accounting firm. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, maybe you read well, but different way of showing the details.
Yeah, please correct me, because I know that I'm not completely right.
Not Saudi Arabia. The American bankers, Chase Manhattan and Citibank, etc., wanted the funds from the Gulf region and from the Arab countries to flow into American banks. So they increased interest rates. And that's why I didn't want to comment, but now I comment. Of course, you will hear from U.S. Embassy and other sources that Beidas is bad, his bank is bad, etc., because they want to replace him. Now, what happened is the major banks in Beirut after Intra became American banks in Beirut, and you can see that in the book. Now, a lot of countries that are loyal to the UK and United States, in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain and the Emirates. The Emirates was not born yet, not the Emirates, but let's say the local chief, the local sheikhs, withdrew their money, and also some wealthy Arabs from Syria and inside Lebanon, and the big withdrawals that hit any bank in the world, even big established banks, are uncalled for in the history of banking at that time in 1966. So the bank needed a little liquidity. And on the night of October 18, the Lebanese cabinet, not the central bank, issued a decree to help banks, because then, people did not only invade the branches of Intra-Bank, they lost trust or confidence in all the banks of Beirut. Yeah. And people rushed to withdraw their money from all the banks. So on Sunday, October 18, the cabinet, the Lebanese government issued a decree to help all the banks with liquidity, except that's one element, except Intra-Bank.
Yeah, that's right.
So this shows you the element of criminality. Why you wouldn't help the largest Lebanese bank? Now, the second thing is the Lebanese Intra-Bank never declared bankruptcy. It was the prime minister on the following day, when questioned by Minister Kamal Dib, show me any document that shows the bank is bankrupt. So what's his name? The prime minister, Abdullah Al-Yafi, he had a lot of connections in the commercial court, and he was connected with the Ministry of the Interior. So he told the judges to invite the members of the board of director, such as Najib Salha and another deputy from Tripoli, to come to talk to him. And he threatened he would arrest them unless they sign documents that they are filing for bankruptcy. So it was really under threat and under fear that they signed those papers. Two British finance consulting declared in their reports that we cannot say that Intra is bankrupt, and they were paid their fees and their on the expense of Intra Bank, and they were dismissed, and they couldn't find anyone to say that Intra is bankrupt. Even the report by Kidder Peabody, if you read it, it will say, let's pay the depositors and let's create new entities. Now, this is evidence for you. Today in 2021, the banks are not paying. They are in trouble. But are they declared bankrupt in Lebanese law? No.
Yeah.
The governor of the central bank, he will say, we will pay, eventually we will pay the depositors certain amounts, and they are protected by insurance. So Intra was never bankrupt.
It looks like we lost mid-sentence. It looks like we lost. Yeah, as we wait, if anyone's interested, just because it's hard to find Warlords and Merchants online, Fawwaz Traboulsi has a really, really great PDF online that you can find about the social economics of Lebanon in the 20th century. It's about like an 80-page, 100-page document that's really, really, really worth checking out if you're interested in this type of stuff. It doesn't look like he's coming back. But yeah, it's worth mentioning. The last part of Kamal's book is basically about the breakdown in the currency and coming out of the Civil War. So what happens after the Civil War, in particular, Hariri's role, Rafiq al-Hariri's role as that sort of merchant business class that takes over. Fadi's question. I'll read Fadi's question. Hi, Fadi. Fadi's question. Can it be that the attack on Intra was also because it was too big and had too much control over the economy, not necessarily in contradiction with the conspiracy against him by other bankers and warlords? Yeah, it's an interesting theory. It could be. I mean, I think Kamal's major thesis is that he was getting it at the end. His major theory is that he was becoming too big and too powerful, and that there was a chance that he was funding with his profits and with his own wealth, that he was funding Palestinian causes. And there was major concerns that was against sort of imperial interests. And he was a brash guy. I mean, in a documented fashion. I mean, there's stories that when the Association of Banks of Lebanon was being formed, he said, if I'm not the president, then this should clearly not be formed because I'm 60% of the industry. Why would I not be the president? Like, it should be, of course it should be me. And that rubbed people the wrong way. Whether it should have or not is besides the point. So he definitely did have enemies across the economy because of his size. But bigger figures outside of Lebanon clearly had a target on his back. It looks like we've lost. Oh no, Kamal's back. I think he's back.
I ran out of battery, but now I solved it. Sorry about that.
No problem. So. Kamal, we have just a couple questions that we're going to get to as we finish up. I can't see you though. You can turn on your camera. I'm going to ask Fadi to unmute himself, and we'll get into the questions. Yeah, if you can read your question, Fadi, that would be great. Because
So my question, thank you. This is really interesting because I actually grew up with that story of Intra being too big for the sake of the Lebanese economy. So I'm just wondering if there was a convergence of interest between the national interest of having a company and a person in particular dominating so much the economy, and then the bankers coming and warlords coming in and using that also their personal and putting their personal interest and their own greed and whatever you mentioned into the game. So there's a sort of a convergence of interest between the national interest and the private interest of other bankers. Can that also explain the kind of attack on it, the kind of full-fledged attack by the state and by the private?
Okay, thank you for your question. Intra Bank was part of several companies that were born in Lebanon in the 1950s and 1960s that pushed for a world scale. I mentioned before the cat company of Emile Boustany, yet there were many others in business, in finance, in tourism, in manufacturing. And if Intra was allowed to continue along with the other big business in Lebanon, they would have been good contributors to modern economy of Lebanon that is part of the global economy and finance. Yet the warlords and the traditional merchants in Lebanon did not want that. They want to perpetuate their control of the Lebanese state. And the evidence is that now almost let's say 55 years after the collapse of Intra, Lebanon has no electricity, no proper infrastructure. Beirut has no subway system. Lebanon has no railroads, and the water supply is threatened, and people buy their bottled water every day. So 55 years after the collapse of Intra, and the allied companies that existed at this time left Lebanon to collapse. On the one side, the never-ending skirmishes and battles and wars amongst the warlords themselves, and the other hand, the continuous theft of money that comes to the public purse. And when the Lebanese could not pay any more taxes, they started borrowing money in order to steal it. And today, $100 billion of Lebanese debt is really the heritage that every Lebanese kid will inherit and continue to pay for many years to come. So that was the outcome of what the warlords and merchants did in the early and mid 1960s.
Thanks, Kamal. Thanks, Fadi. Okay, so we have 2 questions left. We're going to try to get to them quickly. Ryan, you're up next.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you. Yep.
I wanted to ask why it seems like from the graphs that Mikey had up earlier, it seems like the banking crisis, the collapse of Intra, didn't have the kind of chaotic effect on the currency that more recent banking crises have had. And I was wondering if you could explain why the collapse of Intra didn't affect the currency.
Sure.
In that kind of.
Sure. Lebanon was strong in that period. It was called the golden period of the Lebanese Republic. The currency was protected by the gold standard, and at the same time, foreign countries and large corporations in Europe issued bonds in the Lebanese currency because it was strong. Now, Lebanon did suffer because of the Intra crisis in 1966. Basically, what happened is the Lebanese banking system that existed at the same time disappeared and was replaced by a lot of foreign banks. So the banking system of Beirut of the 1966 is never seen, was never born again. And the currency regained its value. And happily, the governor of the central bank was Ilyas Sarkis. Under his leadership, the amount of gold and the strength of the Lebanese Lira was at the historical level. Now, to compare to today, I believe maybe you should read my third book of the Intra trilogy that was issued early 2020. There is a big myth in Lebanon about the strength of the Lebanese pound at 1,500 for the dollar. Well, the true value, and I explained that in details in my book, is probably 3,000 pounds or 5,000. And that did not prevent the Lebanese from indulging in a lot of expensive lifestyle and foreign trips and apartments and a lot of hedonistic consumption. Now, what happened is the central bank and the Hariri team in 1966 and Solidaire and a lot of other interests in Lebanon coalesced together and one night met and decided to peg the Lebanese pound to the dollar in the value of 1,500 to attract dollars to Lebanon. Why? You read also in the book, because the United States and the Arab countries and Europe, the European countries, did not want to give or lend Lebanon any money to realize the development plan presented by Rafik Hariri, and that in 1995. So they said the best thing is to attract dollars, and they paid sometimes 40%. So if you go to one of my interviews on Lebanese television, I was warning that whereas the interbank rate in London is 4 to 6%, the Lebanese government is offering 30 to 40%. It's unbelievable, and it's terrible, and the debt is going to be 200% of the gross domestic product of Lebanon. I said that 20 years ago on Lebanese TV, and you can see it on YouTube. And the person that was also participating in this against me, and he was saying, no, it's untrue. It's Lebanon will grow and we'll have this and we'll have that. And now you see the reality. So it took only a little push in October 2019 to show how fragile and how weak the Lebanese currency was. And the banks acted in a way that showed, going back to 1966, what the banks did is to declare their bankruptcy. I mean, by definition, I studied it 25 years ago in money and banking. The default of any bank of payment to on demand means a sign of a failure or bankruptcy. And that's what happened in Lebanon. Now in Lebanon, they find twisted ways and closing this day and closing tomorrow and having several rates of the exchange rate and denying the fact that the banking system in Lebanon is failing or has failed already. So there is a big difference, to finish off about your question, between what happened in 1966 and what happened in 2019.
Okay, we are over time. So if anyone needs to go, we can go, we can take off. Kamal?
Yes?
Kamal, do you mind if I open up to one final question?
Yes, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, I'll ask, this question comes from my dad, actually. So there you go.
Yes, Kamal, thank you, Mikey. Kamal, I just have a quick question to you. The Lebanese survived the 85-90 devaluation of the Lebanese currency from the 2.5 Lebanese pound to a lira, while it reached the 2,500, which is 1,000 times. And then within a few years, it went down, like you said, the Hariri clan brought it down to the 1,500 and pegged it. How come right now they are not swallowing a 10 times devaluation from the 1,500 to the 15,000, whereby they survived 1,000 time devaluation?
Yes, I don't want to spend time on the 80s, but talk about today. The reason the dollar is so high in Beirut, not because it's supposed to be high, it's for political instability. There is no government, there is no functioning state in Lebanon. That's the major reason. The day that a government is established and foreign confidence is reestablished, you will see that the dollar will go down and that the Lebanese pound could go around 5,000, 6,000. Why I'm saying that? Because you need fundamental economic reasons for currency to devalue or to have a free fall like what happened in the late 1980s. Basically, Lebanon received $6 billion through money transfers last year. And this year, it's supposed to be 9 billion to $11 billion. Last year, it received 6 billion. Plus the end of the Corona crisis, hopefully, plus the tourism or visiting season from outside of Lebanon will be much better compared to last year and the year before. And the fourth factor is that consumer behavior in Lebanon has modified, such as, whereas, as I explained, the Lebanese wrongly and mistakenly imported $19 to $20 billion worth of stuff from the outside. This year, they might import only 7 billion. And in economics, the value of the currency depends on how much it's a trade balance, the imports and the exports. So there is no reason at all for the dollar to be so high. It's only for political situation that is really bad that is causing this problem with the currency.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
What about your questions, your standard questions, Mikey?
Kamal, we had, I was so integrated into what you're saying, and then when you dropped off, I didn't want to spend any time on that.
Sure.
But
for recording, like if you want to record this, so we finish off, because it was my mistake when my battery ran out.
If you have time, I'm happy to do it. I mean,
very
sure,
quickly.
Let's go through them. Yeah, sure. Okay, so What are you reading or watching right now?
I'm reading on, believe it or not, on the Corona crisis. One book is called The Coming Plague by Laurie Garrett, and one book about how humanity is destroying species in the world by Elizabeth Colbert, The Sixth Extinction. And the third book by Canadian author Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, Capitalism and the Climate. So basically, I'm trying to find out why this happened in the world, where humanity is going, why the focus is always on short-term solutions, why governments over the past 40 years spend less on health and education and more on other issues, etc. So that's what I'm reading these days. Yeah.
Okay. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I'm always an admirer of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who is the last living philosopher of the Renaissance philosophy, going back to Immanuel Kant, who dreamt of a universal humanity and international citizenship, etc. So Habermas, living in Germany is a particular interest to me because he talked about civic citizenship compared to the racial citizenship. You know, it's no coincidence that France is called France. That means country of the French. And Germany is country of the German, and Italy, country of the Italians. To Habermas, those are misnomers. It shouldn't be the case. They should go to civic citizenship that emphasizes contribution rather than the blood relation of citizens. He also talked about citizenship in the public sphere. Watch a country. Lebanon is a typical example of a dictatorship. You will find that the sphere, such as the media, is controlled by the warlords. This individual has little say, and this is a test of democracy, where all the media outlets, including the internet, including social media and the television, etc., is controlled by the people in power. So for Habermas, it's a test of democracy when you see that citizens are really participating in the public sphere in running their affairs or not. Just two examples of his fascinating thoughts to me.
Interesting. I know you had a problem with this question, but I think I know the answer to this question. What do people most misunderstand about your work? I think you already hit the answer to this, which is, I wonder if people think that you are defending Beidas versus trying to reveal the true nature of what happened.
Oh, okay. If you are, actually, I wrote 21 books, so to focus on this one, it doesn't matter to me this angle because I'm Canadian first and foremost, and I write what objectivity and academic training gave me. Now about this, that means people either did not read the book to find the passages that really show the bad side of Beidas. Actually, the first chapter is about that, how terrible sometimes was what he did. And the second thing, it's still in 2021, in the interest of the warlords and the merchants to continue to show him as the devil, as a bad person. One quick example, one journalist in Lebanon, very popular, was paid $300,000 to produce a documentary to show how Beidas is terrible, because that's their way of replying to my book. Also, it happened that a nephew of the Palestinian finance minister told me that his uncle visited Beirut, and he said he wanted my book about Yousef Beidas from Jerusalem. And then they said, why did you want this book by Kamal Dib? Yousef Beidas, we know about him. And they gave him a 100-page booklet. He read it in the airport, and it talks about Beidas the thief, Beidas the bad person, Beidas who wanted to take over Lebanon. And it's a pamphlet, it's a propaganda pamphlet published in 1969 to show how Beidas is terrible. So one way of redemption for me is that since I published the first volume in 2014, people now know more about what happened to Lebanon, and people talk about Yousef Beidas, and they know about him. And even when you visit Google and mention that name, you will find a lot of hits compared to unheard of him, or people don't know that this person or this bank existed in the past.
Yeah. Okay, last question. I'm going to ask you to be a little quick. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by, if you were to give a recommendation for somebody we should check out?
All my life, I will continue to be a student of my friend George Corm. He was finance minister in Lebanon for 2 years, but aside from that, he wrote over 20 books about Lebanon and the area, and I'm always inspired by his work. And when I write a book, I ask myself, would George Corm wrote this book this way? Because he mixes social and economic aspects of a study. And I should also add that I was inspired by my friend, the late Patrick Seal, who advised me, when you write a history book, try to write it as a story, because people do not like too much theoretical or words from here and there to show how academic and difficult to understand. Simple history requires simple story.
Okay, everybody, thanks for joining. You can find Kamal's information and his books online. Just search his name, very easy to find. I posted a link into the chat. Was this good? I'll send it in email as well. And support us, keep our work going and growing. You can go to AFIKRA.com/support to join the hundreds of people around the world who make this work possible. And join us. Our next event is on Saturday. We are collaborating with the Shabak Festival in London, one of the big arts and culture festivals focused on the Arab world. Excited to be able to partner with them on this stuff. So look out for that information online. And Kamal, thank you so much for sharing your time and your perspective with us. This was hugely informational.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.